I'm Dan Esty, a professor at the Yale School of the Environment, and it's my privilege and honor to welcome you this evening to what is going to be a wonderful conversation around the future role of the sustainable city in helping us move towards more broadly a sustainable society. And the conversation we're about to have is part of an ongoing effort at Yale at the School of the Environment to drive discussion on critical issues, bringing to bear cutting edge science, data, and analysis, in some cases from our Yale professors, in other cases from others across the country and around the world. And this Yale Environmental Dialogue, as we call it, has produced over the past year a fabulous book that I hope some of you will pick up called A Better Planet, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. And it is just what it promises in its title. It's a sweeping view across the sustainability challenges we face as a society, thinking about a wide range of concerns and bringing to bear cutting edge thinking. And in that book is a chapter by Karen Seto, who will be part of our program tonight, in which she lays out her vision of planetary sustainability in the urban century. That is, in fact, her chapter title and really a foundation for the conversation we're having tonight. Our goal with this broader effort is to identify pathways to a sustainable future and to think about how to make that happen. How do we actually deliver solutions and move the process forward across divisions of party label and other divides that sometimes prevent progress from occurring. Our focus again today is on the urban setting, on the city of the future, on what's required to make city life sustainable, and frankly, digging into the reality that globalization and urbanization are occurring across the world. And in doing so, we are seeing a world that is ever more urban, making the success from a sustainability point of view of our cities critical to the planet's future. And as I'm sure you will hear from our speakers, the data on this is astounding, and it really does implicate all aspects of urban life, from how the cities are built, to the construction of the infrastructure, to the roads and transport systems, to health and equity issues. And to lead us through the conversation today, we've got a fabulous friend of the Yale School of the Environment, Jonathan Rose. Jonathan is probably known to many of you. He is the founder and president of the Jonathan Rose Companies. And that is a group of multidisciplinary development, planning, and investment entities that work to create real estate and planning models that are aimed at just the question of the day, the challenges of the 21st century, and really thinking about how to create more environmentally, socially, and economically resilient, as well as sustainable cities. So with that, I want to turn over to Jonathan the virtual microphone, although I also want to flag his book, The Well-Tempered City, What Modern Science, Ancient Civilizations, and Human Nature Teach Us About the Future of Urban Life. Jonathan, I know you're going to kick us off with one of the most critical issues, and that is the equitable distribution of opportunity in the city of the future. And with that, let me pass the virtual microphone and thank you for your support for this effort and for leading the conversation tonight.
And thank you, Dan, so much for joining us and kicking this off. And I think one of the goals of tonight is to actually highlight some of the amazing things that are going on at Yale. And Dan has been so early at the law school and also at the School of Environment as an environmental thinker and leader and doer. So just a second, I am going to bring up a PowerPoint. All right, hopefully you can all see this. Can somebody say, can you see it? Okay, this is a map of intergenerational poverty. If you were born in 1940 and turned 26 in 1966, and you were born in the bottom quartile of income in the United States, born in 1940, you would have a 90% chance of earning more than your low-income parents. And this was interestingly across all races. So if you were born in a sharecropper family in the South, you may have moved to Detroit or Chicago and had a union job. America was really a cauldron of opportunity back then for a whole series of demographic and economic reasons. If you're born in 1990, so this is what this is a map of. If you were born in 1990 and turned 26 in 2016, and you're born in a bottom quartile family, there's a 70% chance that at the age of 26, you're earning less than your low-income parents. So we've gone from a nation of opportunity to an enormous nation of lack of opportunity. And that lack of opportunity is very geographically and place-based. So in this map, the deeper the red, the lower the chance of opportunity. The deeper the white, the higher the chance of intergenerational opportunity. You can look at all kinds of zip code maps, and we know that, for example, there are places where statistically the lifespan is 60 years, and literally one can be a mile away and have a lifespan, a statistical lifespan of 80 years. We know that you can be, I grew up in a zip code in which 95% of the kids went to college, and there's zip codes in which 0% of the kids went to college. And so what this tells us is that the constituents of opportunity, which tie very close to what are also called the social determinants of health, are extremely geographically placed. Their poor distribution is a massive sign of injustice, but the fact that they are place-based means that they can actually be solved in place. And so I want to start this event by framing that issue and showing you a simple solution that is, or it's a complex solution, but it's a solution that our company has in development right now. It's a full city block in East Harlem, surrounded by public housing, a very poor community. This is 111th to 112th Park Avenue on the right and Madison on the left of this image. This is in construction, so this is a rendering of what it will look like. It's 2 blocks from Central Park. It is 700 units of affordable housing. It ranges from formerly homeless to middle income. We really believe in mixed income housing. It will be the largest passive house project in the United States. Climate change is an enormous issue which is affecting all of us. And no matter what solution we undertake, every solution has to move towards reducing climate impacts. Passive house buildings are so well insulated that they use about 30% of the energy of a normal building. This building has not only affordable housing in it, but has a 50,000 square foot charter school with the Harlem Children's Zone, an exemplary education organization. It has 12,000 square feet of services with a group called Union Settlement that has been serving the neighborhood for over 125 years. These social services include services for elderly, after-school education programs, youth employment programs, et cetera. It has 4 community gardens, a whole commitment to community health, community arts program. And so what we have each one of these elements, education, health, social services, et cetera, we know help overcome that opportunity disparity. We know the mixed income housing does. And the question is, if we bring these all together, might there be a positive cumulative effect? And we think so. By the way, the whole project is designed in Fibonacci proportions, which are the sacred geometries of the earth. This interior courtyard follows the pathway of an old Lenape Indian trail and is designed with a whole series of elements, playgrounds, an amphitheater, a science garden that actually has a map of the stars above and LED lights below, places for children. All the species planted here are ones that Mannahatta species, they're the species that existed in 1491 and prior. So I just show this to you to say that the problems that we face today, in many ways, we're going to talk about what I'm going to call both hardware solutions and software solutions. So, but we need to physically transform the environments that we're in part to achieve these. And then there's social programs that we're going to need to do too. So with that overview, our first speaker is Karen Seto. And Karen is going to talk about the big picture and linking, then delve much deeper into this issue about the relationship between cities and climate change. Karen is the Frederick C. Hixon Professor of Geography and Urbanization at Yale University. Her research focuses on how urbanization affects the planet. And she's been working with remote satellite sensing and has pioneered methods to reconstruct historical land use and forecast urban expansion. So she's involved in very dynamic interpretation of what's going on in cities. So Karen, we're eager to hear your thoughts. You're on mute, Karen.
Oh, okay.
We got you. All right.
Okay. All right. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Well, my message is pretty straightforward, and the message is this: that if we are going to solve the climate crisis, we have to do it starting with cities. So, just to put this in perspective, existing urban areas, existing cities, that is, emit about 3/4 of CO2 emissions from final energy use. Those are the cities that have already been built. So the urban share of global emissions is high, and it's increasing. And in fact, if the emissions of the top 50 cities were aggregated into a single country, it would rank third behind China and the United States. So one of the biggest challenge before us with regard to climate change is to transform existing cities and make them more climate neutral. So by retrofitting, rebuilding, and transforming them. But that's actually not what I'm going to talk about. I'm actually going to talk about this window, and I chose this because I think many of us are not seeing this view anymore. But I went back in the day when I flew a lot. I liked being on a plane because it gave me a chance to think about what the world could be. And there is this window of opportunity over the next 30 years. And what happens over the next 30 years will be critical for the fate of the planet. And I know that sounds like a hyperbole, but in fact, it's quite clear that how we build our cities in the next 20 to 30 years will be really central for solving climate change and a number of other issues as well. Over the next 30 years, the world urban population is going to increase by about 2.5 billion people. That is about 1.5 million new urban dwellers every single week. So today we're at about 4.2-ish. We're going to get out to about 6.7 billion by 2050. So this magnitude, this pace of urbanization is something that the world has never seen before. To accommodate 2.5 billion more urban dwellers, what we're going to see is, on aggregate, every single day for the next 30 years, an area equal to about 23,000 American football fields will become built and become urban. And if we aggregate all of that, all those areas over the next 30 years, it is equivalent to an combined area of France, Germany, Spain, and Italy combined. So it's a lot of land, and it's going to be a lot of resources. And in fact, the UN had a report a couple of years ago that several YSC faculty contributed to, and they forecasted the resources that would be required to build future cities under business as usual scenarios. And one of the things that they concluded was that the resources that would be required to build cities under business as usual scenario would far exceed what the planet can sustainably provide, going from 40 billion tons of resources a year to 90 billion tons by 2050. We can see from satellite images that building cities is land and resource intensive. So this is evident in the satellite image of Las Vegas. This is Vegas in 1976 with Lake Mead to the east. We're going to fast forward to present day, and you can see that Las Vegas has increased threefold, and not surprisingly, Lake Mead has shrunken significantly. But this trend of urbanization is happening not only in big cities and not only in places like in the US, but also in the Himalaya and also in smaller towns. Here's a picture of a town in the Himalaya, Cherakat in Nepal in the early 90s. This is Cherakat today. And so we're seeing that the construction of infrastructure for fast growing cities is happening all around the world. And the IPCC concludes that developing the infrastructure itself, just the infrastructure, to build the infrastructure not to operate cities, but just to build the cities, could release 350 gigatons of carbon by 2050. This is 4 times the amount that's used to build existing infrastructure. So this is significant, just to build the cities of tomorrow. At the same time, urban expansion also significantly impacts our existing carbon sinks. So the ability of natural ecosystems to sequester carbon on the order of about 22 million tons of carbon a year. That is equivalent to about 9% of the carbon emissions that comes from fossil fuels and cement emissions worldwide. So this is pretty significant. And again, I just want to underscore that building future cities is going to result in significant embodied greenhouse gas emissions. And it's estimated that if cities of tomorrow are built in the fashion of the cities today, the emissions to create these cities is going to take up about 60% of the remaining carbon budget if global warming is limited to 2 degrees C. Why is that going to happen? Well, if you see in this graph, we have here on the left in red, this is per capita emissions that are embodied in the infrastructure of essentially developed countries. And so there's going to be new infrastructure to improve the infrastructure of countries and cities that are already in existence. But we're going to have to build new infrastructure for all this new population growth. And again, most of this population growth is going to happen in cities. So this is a significant 350 gigatons. The IPCC released a special report of global warming of 1.5 degrees C. And in that report, they underscore that if we are to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C, we must have transformational systemic change in 4 systems: energy, land, industry, and in urban and infrastructure systems. So I'll just conclude my brief remarks by saying that this window of opportunity is there in how we design and build these cities of tomorrow, but this window will close as well, because once these infrastructures are laid out, it's going to lock in place patterns of behavior and lifestyles that are very, very difficult to change once they are in place. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was a great overview. And one of the things that you mentioned that was so important was the issue of the carbon footprint of actually building the cities. And that you actually had on your slide, you had a little note that they're built out of concrete and steel and glass and copper. But there's another way to build. And Alan Organschi is going to talk about that. Alan is the senior critic at the Yale School of Architecture and a principal at Gray Organschi, which is a great architecture firm. He's a member of the steering committee of the Cities and Climate Change Network, an international consortium of scientists, policymakers, and design practitioners engaged in interdisciplinary research and the implementation of global projects on carbon mitigation and climate adaptation, which is critical. So, all right, Alan, what are we going to do?
Thanks, Jonathan. No, that's not the right one. So I'd like to just move around some of the silverware on the table that Karen has already beautifully set for us. And I'd like to talk about 2 landscapes, this forest and the city. These landscapes have been historically antagonistic, as Karen's satellite imagery so beautifully showed. And what I'd like to do is propose that there can be actually a synergy that both increases forest health and builds convivial urban environments. So I don't want to talk about how cities are function or their socio-political makeup or their architecture even. What I'd like to talk about very simply is what they're made of. For every city, glorious post-industrial city that, rich, wonderful place that we build somewhere on the planet is some figurative, or in some cases, literal hole in the ground from which we've extracted enormous volumes of resources, consumed enormous amount of energy to extract those resources, and emitted enormous amounts of waste in the form of greenhouse gases and solid waste that has further limited the capacity of the Earth to recover from these incursions. So let me just talk about some confluences that I think are really critical in the way that we talk about how we build. First of all, obviously, climate, a sort of guardrail established during the Paris Accord for how much global warming should be allowed since the Industrial Revolution, a carbon budget of 420 billion tons of greenhouse gas that we can emit since the Industrial Revolution and are remaining. And we happen to emit 1/10 of that every year, which means that by 2030, we have blown through the guardrail of 1.5 degrees centigrade. Additionally, as Karen's pointed out, we're urbanizing rapidly, 2.3 billion people who will need new housing and infrastructure, and that will come at great cost and occupy enormous areas of land. And this is good news for the construction sector, which I'm involved in, because this is going to be worth about $97 trillion, which is more than the current value of the entire built environment globally. And that means essentially that we're going to build 53,000 square miles of building, which is not a city the size of New York State. It's literally a building the size of New York State, or for any Europeans in the audience, 2 Irelands. And that will that will incur impact. For right now, the building sector, the production, operation, demolition, and waste removal of buildings accounts for at least 40% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And by 2050, after we've passed all these critical thresholds, of that 40+% of greenhouse gas emissions that we're responsible for in building, half of that will have been caused by embodied emissions. In other words, the huge carbon spike that's created at the beginning of the building life cycle through the extraction, production, transport, and assembly of materials. So no matter how efficient our buildings are, we still haven't paid off all of the material and energy impacts associated with making those buildings. So the carbon cycle and the biosphere and those upper very thin layers of lithosphere that we've used historically to create building has been completely transformed by the post-industrial city. The kinds of energy and emissions intensive classes of materials that we use to build. And we've literally, as I pointed out at the very beginning, kind of dug ourselves into a hole with incredible land use impact, reduction of the photosynthetic capacity of the biomass in that land, and an enormous footprint caused by the emissions of the transport and production of materials. Just to compare the simplest primary structural materials that we use to build cities, concrete, steel, and timber. If you just look at them as a matter of weight, concrete and timber are fairly close, steel emits more per ton. But if you think about the strength to weight ratio of these materials, and timber has an incredibly high strength to weight ratio, you start to realize that the carbon footprint of timber and the carbon footprint of concrete by strength to emissions ratio is actually really, really high. And if we add the capacity of these materials to store carbon, that's where we start to see real benefits in biogenic materials. And so for the purposes of this talk, let's just say that a metric ton of timber has a capacity to store 1.5 tons of carbon dioxide. And wood isn't our old wood anymore. It's a host of really fascinating, high strength engineered materials. Cross-laminated timber is the sort of poster child for this new movement, which have now been recognized as incredibly amenable to the most efficient manufacturing techniques using the highest technology in manufacturing, and have been recognized by the International Building Code institution that is notoriously slow in making change, has been recognized as a feasible means to build dense, fairly tall buildings. But we don't want to get into the discussion of a sort of arms race of who can make the tallest building in the world out of wood. To me, the question really goes to, how do we build the huge stock of building that will serve the needs of this rapidly growing population? And moreover, can we use regenerative silvicultural techniques to produce not only the material that we need to build these cities, but to increase forest health? to potentially even incentivize afforestation and the expansion of forests. And along with this potential boom in timber building, can this serve as a kind of geotechnology, this synergistic relationship between forests and cities? An important piece here is that density matters. We use wood, which has actually got a really low emissions profile, to produce an incredibly inefficient housing morphology, suburban sprawl, while the really emissions and energy intensive systems of building and materials that we use to build with produce actually extremely efficient urban morphologies, tall buildings with shared building envelopes. So how do we break the relationship between the mineral extractive industry that produces concrete and steel and urban building, and the relationship that unfortunately delegates wood, which is highly efficient and renewable, to a really inefficient morphology? And we believe you do that through the analysis of regional supply chains and forests, understanding forest flux, the kinds of species that are coming out of forests, how you map those onto urban building assemblies, how you track the carbon storage potential of these things, and how you actually understand the history of carbon past 350 million years ago, the slow accretion of lithospheric carbon, over 2 centuries, the emissions of a lot of that carbon into the atmosphere. Can we imagine a future in which with bio-based buildings, we can create a new kind of sink or reservoir of carbon in the buildings that we will inevitably build for that growing population? And in the meantime, make modest but beautiful housing for our populations, institutions for our children to learn in that are healthy and provide great indoor air quality, and most importantly, transform a construction sector that knows business as usual well, but is resistant to change. Thank you.
Wow, Alan, fantastic. Thank you. So we're delving now into the hardware of cities in this fantastic timber city. So the biggest creations of environmental impacts in cities are the buildings and the people in the buildings and how the people get to and from the buildings. So we're now going to talk about the transportation sector with Robert Cervero, who's a professor emeritus of city planning and regional planning at University of California in Berkeley. He's the former director of Berkeley's Institute of Urban and Regional Development. He's one of the founders of the actual phrase transit-oriented development, and his research and planning work focuses on the relationship between transportation and land use. His most recent book is Beyond Mobility, which won the 2019 Urban Design Best Book Award. So Robert, talk to us about mobility disruptors in cities.
Okay, great. Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank the good folks from Yale for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join the conversation from the West Coast. I assume my PowerPoint is displayed here, yes?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. So as Jonathan had mentioned, I'm going to focus my brief remarks on transport, the mobility sector. And I think it's well understood that transport is critically important towards decarbonizing our cities, but also democratizing our cities. You know, the automobile has been just a disproportionate consumer of scarce resources, including land. And we're really experiencing it with COVID, the need to physically distance. It's very hard to do in crowded sidewalks. So how can we reclaim part of the city in ways that not only improve public health, but also advance social justice? The popular media covers these topics quite well, mobility disruptors in cities, but I thought I would, as I think about the city of the future and aspirations, which Jonathan challenged us to do, I would frame my remarks around this. And I'll at the risk of oversimplification, these technological advances, but also lifestyle shifts and megatrends that are unfolding very rapidly. There's two countervailing influences as it relates to the transport sector. One set of influences are encouraging a more compact, dense city and accordingly less travel. And of course, here we would include things like e-commerce. You know, we're basically eliminating a lot of physical shop trips, to brick and mortar establishments being replaced by parcel trucks, which creates their own issues as they intrude into neighborhoods. And how do we efficiently, maybe through consolidation centers, combine parcels so we have much better urban logistics of delivering stuff. But nonetheless, all the experiences are telling us it is reducing travel. And of course, shared mobility, as we begin sharing cars and bicycles and motor scooters and so forth, it's very clear that automobile ownership rates are declining. And tied to that, of course, cities like Houston, where 35% of precious scarce land area is devoted to parking and thoroughfares for cars or whatever, we can shrink that footprint and perhaps have things like less parking. And I just put this image here of converting parking lots where, the whole idea is to future-proof our parking instead of building sloping floors and 9-foot ceilings. We might design them so we can one day convert to parking if autonomous vehicles and to housing, affordable housing, if autonomous vehicles and other advances allow this. So anyway, those are a set of factors which are in favor of infill, compactness, less vehicle miles traveled per capita. So as we benchmark sustainability in the transport sector, we tend to look at VMT per capita. As vehicle miles traveled per person goes down, so do tailpipe emissions, carbon emissions, land consumption, all of the large ecological costs we associate with the transport sector. But working against this are, a countervailing influence are factors which are leading to decentralization, sprawl, and more travel. And we would include here, of course, like autonomous vehicles, which are the latest in a whole series of technological advances which improve the efficiency of vehicles, allow us to squeeze more cars into limited road space at higher speeds. And one of the big concerns is that autonomous vehicles just take the house out of driving, and you can multitask. And in so doing, your perception of impedance, distance as a barrier, is going to be weakened, and that's going to unleash a whole new round of suburbanization. Now, when this happens, there's a lot of uncertainties, whether it's 2030 or 2040 or 2050, when we have full autonomous vehicles, that is level 5, where pretty much the vehicle does everything. But nonetheless, it's going to happen in the next 20 to 30 years. I think it's very much understood. And other factors that could work against sustainability is increased private mobility in the post-Covid city. As people have shifted away from public transit to driving, a lot of people expect that to continue. And then things like remote work. Well, we do eliminate commute trips with teleworking, but if you only go to work 2 days a week or so, it's an incentive to live further out of the city. Most of the models have looked at these various factors and influences, are probably suggesting, the numbers are all over the place, but a net increase in vehicle miles traveled per capita. Now, if that additional travel is by electric vehicles, then from a carbon standpoint, at least, some of these issues are dealt with. But what I would submit is, trying to advance these set of factors favoring decentralization versus compact city, it really creates, in certain ways, a unique opportunity to reinvigorate physical land use planning and to design cities to achieve this kind of what urban geographers have long referred to as a polycentric settlement pattern, versus kind of market-driven willy-nilly sprawl. And if we have the institutional resources and capacities to actually physically design and steer and guide growth, we could achieve a lot of tremendous gains. Now, the multi-center metropolis, the idea is that you would have these centers where you have high-speed connectors, electric trains, but even electric tollways for electric cars, say. But the important thing is that you regionally balance this growth so you have bi-directional, multi-directional flows in the peak period, versus the typical metropolis where jobs are in the center, a couple of activity centers, and sprawls all over the place, and the freeways and trains and buses are jam-packed in one direction and half empty in the other. With a well-designed polycentric metropolis, you can get efficient bi-directional flows and shrink the footprint of infrastructure. But what's critically important is within these centers, and that's where this aspirational vision, if you will, of the accessible city. I think pretty much every city around the world now has embraced this idea that within the immediate community, we want to design it such that the vast majority of activities, say 65, 70, 75% of everyday activities, going to the grocery market, to the pharmacy, meeting friends, recreation, can take place by foot within 5 to 10 to 15 minutes, or bicycle, or even some form of micromobility. But instead of trips spilling outside of the community and being dependent on cars and so forth, we achieve a much more physically active, but also sustainable urban landscape. Now, what this obviously requires is a strong commitment to building pedestrian infrastructure, cycle tracks, but also any form of efficient, sustainable mobility. Now, part of this, I think, is understood within the accessible city. We're all aware of the explosive growth in motor scooters, electric bikes. This is an image, excuse me, of the San Francisco Chronicle of all the different fleets you find on the streetscape. Sort of this first last mile connectivity, because the reality is, because of inclement weather, aging populations, not everyone's going to want to walk all the time for 10 to 15 minutes. So the market clearly is going to be there for micromobility, and it's partly these are vulnerable road users, risk of accidents, building the necessary infrastructure to accommodate them efficiently as well. And tied to this is this critically important notion of mobility as a service, where increasingly it's understood that as we try to design cities where you're trying to move about and share different modes, it really is a form of conveyance, not unlike a people mover at an airport or an escalator at a shopping center. And with mobility as a service, you no longer obviously own the vehicle. Instead, you subscribe to a service, and based on your origin destination, your desired travel time, how much time you want to wait for, and a price, they'll package a set of seamless connectors. And the notion is, and there's some evidence of this, is that if it is a form of conveyance, you lose your attachment to the ownership of the vehicle. And that's part of the incentive why we find so many families in households with a large number of cars. So all of these things are unfolding. A city like Helsinki, Finland, for instance, has a very active program called WIM that has captured a very significant of the traveling public to their mobility as a service. Excuse me. And my last slide, I did want to emphasize that all of these core notions I've just briefly outlined are most relevant to the global north. And the truth is, most of our future urbanization is going to be in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, the global south. And in many ways, the mobility challenges are fundamentally different. And I just showed this image here of Ho Chi Minh City, where roughly 90% of mechanized trips are by motorcycles, motor scooters, mopeds. And you find this in other parts of the world. It's not four-wheelers, it's two-wheelers. Even instead of ride-hail services like Uber and Lyft, they're using motorcycle taxis. So it's really our fundamentally different challenges. And of course, a lot of our rapidly urbanizing cities, growing cities around the world are coastal cities, and they're very vulnerable to rising sea levels. So this happens to be an example of an idea. Peter Calthorpe, I've been working with him and his team. We're trying to build a couple of new towns in the highlands, excuse me, above Ho Chi Minh City. And the idea is to really build a very efficient e-bike network, a couplet of one-way streets, if you will, that segregate these vulnerable road users from cars and eliminate some of the stop and go kind of helter-skelter traffic jams, chaos that you find on the streets. Actually, Ho Chi Minh City has built a bus rapid transit system, and they're actually building a metro system, and they're finding the youth, particularly Gen Zs, really value the door-to-door connectivity of motor scooters, and it's an underutilized BRT system. So if that's the sort of lifestyle preference, let's kind of design and plan for it. So this idea, again, is this dedicated e-bike street, grade separated at critical junctures, but it really allows high efficiency and sustainability in travel patterns. Now, of course, the challenge is, where does the electricity come from? If it's coming from coal-fired power plants, you're not going to decarbonize the cities. And equally important is, what do you do with these batteries? If you can really shift over to smaller solid state batteries where instead of liquid electrolytes, which cause fires, are very unstable, have a much more efficient battery technology, and reuse them and recycle them. So the waste to energy equation and sort of the circular economy concepts are really trying to be advanced in this plan itself. So I'll close with those comments.
Thank you so much, Robert. So now we're going to move on to the subject of health and the cities. And our presenter is Dr. Albert Ko, who's the department chair and professor of epidemiology and medicine and the department chair of epidemiology of microbial diseases. Anybody heard of a microbial disease recently? I think we all have. He's at the Yale School of Public Health, and his research centers on the health problems that have emerged as the consequence of rapid urbanization and social inequity. And so, Dr. Ko, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And so, first of all, thank you for the invitation to participate with this panel on a subject that is truly important even during this pandemic. So let me pick up on the initial points that Jonathan raised about equity, using perhaps some of the silverware of Alan and Robert, and try to look through the window of Karen through the lens of health. I wanted to pick up on what Robert said. So I think the one thing, if we're looking forward, the major transformation when we think about cities is going to be the growth in it's going to be the growth in the cities in the poorest countries of the world. You can see in the red line, this is the proportion of the world's population that are living in cities or urban centers in the most developed countries. And you can see this linear increase in the growth of populations in our poorest countries in the world. And then when we go to the smaller micro scale, you can see that this, together, this demographic transition, together with, really the crippling social inequity that hasn't been attenuated by economic growth in much of the developing world, leading to this changes or the differences, stark differences between communities where they're very close in distance, but very far in social distance. And as a large consequence of that, are the production of these unhealthy communities, whether they're slum settlements or favelas in Portuguese. We have environmental degradation and really a setup for many of the poor health outcomes that we're seeing currently in our urban centers. And going through some of those processes and diseases, and this is just to highlight, what has been the concomitant impacts on health as we're seen by drivers of urbanization and social inequity. One is the rural to urban migration, which has brought diseases from the countryside, the neglected tropical diseases such as leprosy to the cities, the changing ecosystems in these urban centers. Many of these urban centers were pristine rainforests that have been now sprawling, densely populated urban slum communities. I think one of the best examples is of this is the epidemics that we've had, most recently Zika, but continuously with dengue, these mosquito-borne diseases that have been fueled by plastics, the lack of access to refuse collection, the abundance of breeding sites in urban communities throughout the Americas, throughout the tropics, which is expanding because of climate change, and creating the perfect incubator or ever expanding incubator for not only the vector that transmits these arboviral diseases or diseases such as Zika, dengue, chikungunya, malaria, but also the diseases themselves. We have, as being played out very well concurrently, has been the influence of overcrowding in movement on the COVID pandemic. Jonathan had asked the question about, will the COVID pandemic influence de-densification of our cities? It may, and it may in the privileged cities, in the world. It may for the privileged populations or economic classes, but those aren't really options for the large majority of the poor who reside in urban centers. I think one example of really having no options in being unable to escape a poor environment, unhealthy environment, is a situation in South Africa, where you have people have to take minibus taxis from peri-urban townships into the city for work, which is one of the major risk factors for tuberculosis and the spread of tuberculosis, which is devastating places like South Africa, but many other parts of the developing world. Then we have that kind of paradox that, with the increased access that urban advantage of going to the cities, moving to the cities has, you also have inadequate access to health services, which has fueled the global emergence of antimicrobial resistance. And then I think lastly, many of the examples, I'm sort of biased, I'm an infectious disease physician, epidemiologist, but really the true challenges that we're having when we think about urbanization and health are going to be due to the increasingly aging population that occurs during urbanization, as well as the unhealthy cities, which are going to fuel the epidemics of non-communicable diseases, hypertension, metabolic syndrome, accidents, violence, and mental health diseases. So let me try to now step back a little bit and try to try to open up Karen's window about how what would that window of opportunity be? And when we think about our lifetimes, most of the lifetimes, actually the story has been very different. We've had a rapidly urbanizing world, but we've also had large increases or improvements in our health status, not only in the most wealthy countries, but also in the least developed countries. These are just two indicators. One is life expectancy and the other is childhood mortality. And you can see the major advances that happened in the last 50 or 60 years along that. And much of that, we like to say on the medical or public health side, that was because of sanitation, oral rehydration, vaccines, and so forth. But much of this has really been the contribution of urbanization and the social determinants of health, which Jonathan had mentioned in the beginning. And when we think about this, and this is actually a very nice analysis that Christopher Dye from the World Bank published in Science. If you look at that, why do people from impoverished areas, impoverished rural regions go to impoverished urban slum communities? Well, there is a health advantage. There's a health advantage, there's an economic advantage, there's an education advantage. This just lays out, you can see that across much of the developing world, health outcomes are much improved. This is with respect to infant mortality rates in urban centers than they are in rural regions. However, that advantage of living in urban centers is mitigated by the health disparities. You can see this is the ratio on an X and Y axis of the poorest quartile compared to the richest quartile. And you can see how urbanization magnifies these health disparities. And that's what's happened in the past, and that's what's going to happen in the future unless we intervene and we crawl through that window of opportunity that Karen is referred to. So how do we do that? This is a very health-centric, medical-centric understanding of how the world works, with microbes and humans. But this really goes back to the fact, what are the opportunities? What are the windows of opportunities? They're actually at the intersection of the physical environmental factors with the microbe, with the humans, the ecological factors, the biological factors, as well as importantly, social, political, economic factors, including good governance. And I think one of the challenges when we're thinking about moving forward and what our vision will be for the future is how do we deal with issues of heterogeneity? What are the types of solutions that are going to be, relevant or applicable and effective and usable and feasible in places like Newhallville and Dixwell, right close nearby to us, opposed to places like Rocinha, the community of the urban slum community in Rio de Janeiro. And you can see that there's not only the issue of scale or heterogeneity, but also the issue of scale. And those are the issues that I think the intersection, the multidisciplinary intersection between environment, architecture, urban planning, health, is going to be critical to address. So let me stop there with my presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Coe. Very interesting. Our last presentation is from Katie Paris, and it's going to take the ideas of how we implement these solutions further. Katie is the director of building of LeBreton and the National Capital Commission in Ottawa, Canada. She oversees the planning and implementation of the National Capital Commission's new approach to redeveloping LeBreton Flats, which is a 70-acre redevelopment site that will be transformed into a highly sustainable, inclusive, and resilient community. So Katie, show us how you're going to address these issues and some of the challenges in trying to address these issues.
In 5 minutes flat. Thank you.
5 minutes flat, and then we're going to get to some questions. And just one other thing I'm going to just say, with the panelists who've spoken, take a look at the questions that have come in. Some are very specifically for you, and let's go those answered, and then we'll have a general discussion of the more generalist questions.
Great. And thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for your valiant attempt to pronounce LeBreton. As Jonathan said, I am with the National Capital Commission. It's an agency of the Canadian government whose mission is to make Canada's capital a place that all Canadians can be proud of. So we have an incredible opportunity here to build a truly sustainable and inclusive urban community at LeBreton Flats. I'll start with a little bit of history and some context and then tell you about our project. LeBreton Flats is located at the heart of our community here in Ottawa-Gatineau in the National Capital Region of Canada, just between the two provinces, Ontario and Quebec. So geography is really at the heart of this story. Just to the north of our site is a magnificent waterfall sacred to the people of the region's First Nation, the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. They call it Akikojuan. The French settlers likened it to a boiling cauldron or chaudière. It's known as Chaudière Falls, and unfortunately now a dam disguises most of its former glory. Generations of Anishinaabe portaged or carried their canoes by land around the falls on their travel and trading routes, as later did fur trappers and settlers. Some of the first European settlers to reach this region pulled their boats out at a portage site on the Ontario shoreline, just east of LeBreton Flats, cutting a path through LeBreton. Settlers remained here, building taverns and houses and eventually a community, and a huge timber industry emerged here to support the early growth of the country that, of course, eventually became Canada. LeBreton Flats has been utterly transformed several times over, completely remade. First, Europeans, of course, cut down the forest and settled there. Then the timber industry brought huge mills, railroads, and hydropower. Then the Great Fire of 1900 completely wiped it out, with post-fire reconstruction then creating a working class community, and finally the federal government expropriated, or as you would say, condemned the whole place in the 1960s, displacing thousands of people and businesses and completely cleared the lands, as you can see in the lower corner of the slide. The lands were intended at the time for a massive project at Pentagon North, a modernist office precinct that was never built. Other plans were put in place, partially built, delayed, canceled, and finally some progress was made. Affordable housing was constructed in the 1980s. In the early 2000s, a beautiful museum was built, a park was installed, some more new housing was built on a small part of the site. And recently, a new light rail transit system was constructed with 2 stations built and in operation on the site. But the great majority of the cleared site remains undeveloped. After a business partnership conflict caused a collapse of a development plan for this site in recent years, we are now on the cusp of actually building a new community. I've given this extensive history and context as it is important to understand the weight of history here. This is not just any brownfield. The site is at the center of our region's Indigenous history, of Canadian settlement and industrialization. And it also has a legacy of harmful urban renewal practices. So at this point, we've got to make good on its promise. So when we approach this new phase, we first ask the public what they really want to see here. From their input, we adopted these 7 guiding principles, a framework which will steer our decision-making and help us track progress. People want to see a people place, making the most of our unique, undeveloped site next to the river, and our role as a capital building organization to create a new destination in the region and design a community that sets a bar for other developments in Canada. They see a sustainable neighborhood with great active mobility options, connections to the LRT stations, restorative green spaces, and a net zero carbon target. We also heard they want to see a diverse, inclusive, and affordable community, and they want to see us make amends with those displaced from the site, both the working class community that was removed and the Indigenous communities who call this region home. We intend this to be a highly sustainable community with targets for connections to district energy, net zero carbon, and high rates of waste diversion, among other things. We intend to attract great new cultural uses, whether galleries, tourist attractions, or music venues, or perhaps even an NHL hockey arena, if that's your idea of culture. And we also define our success to the extent that we build community, build a real community that is inclusive with services, parks, great places to visit, schools, daycares, health centers, and so on. And yes, affordable housing. This project is committed to creating both social and environmental benefits. How are we going to get all this done? Our financial model is to reinvest the proceeds from the sale of our lands back into the project to support the delivery of the benefits. The project also builds in the potential for partnerships and benefits for the Algonquin Anishinaabe communities with whom we're in ongoing discussions. And we're working closely with other levels of government, including the City of Ottawa, to align our plans and coordinate investments. Tangibly, we are walking the talk in our first competition for purchase of lands. The library parcel, so-called as it will be, located very close to a dynamic new central library, is an example of the kind of project economics that it will take to create social and environmental benefits. Through a partnership with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the CMHC, we're offering the lands at a deep discount to market value in exchange for securing the delivery of affordable housing, net zero design, and universal accessibility. Valued at $30 million, those are Canadian dollars, the lands may be purchased by the winning bidder at a minimum 72% discount, or for $8.4 million. That's the maximum price. Ultra high building performance is required with a certification by the Canada Green Building Council of zero carbon design and operations. 30% of the units must be affordable, defined as 80% of our average market rents for 25 years. And if the bidder exceeds the minimum requirements, the land can be further discounted all the way down to zero. The community is watching and pushing us to keep these commitments, and our nearly completed plan is our social contract containing our strategies and long-term targets to deliver benefits. We'll continue to work phase by phase to incorporate strong requirements and sources of support for our development partners. We're working hard to try to shift thinking as we work within the existing economic framework, which doesn't always reward an approach that values social and environmental benefits. Our government context is also starting to shift towards these goals with increasing commitments from our federal government towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions and recognizing the savings that we can obtain through our projects, and from our municipal government as well, for instance, with intensification and a mix of uses encouraged at higher order transit stations. With that, I will welcome your thoughts and questions and stop right there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katie. And one of the lessons that really comes from your presentation is that we really need a public-private partnership, that we need the public planning consents and the public ability to have cheap land and coordinate the land and the private sector to execute it. So I'm going to now go to some questions that have come from the audience, and one that is 3 different people have asked. So I'm going to ask this to anybody, and everybody in the panel wants to answer it, is what are your opinions of Neom, which is a new planned city in Saudi Arabia? And why don't we start with Robert, because there's a particular question here about the transportation aspect of this. Oh, we can't hear you.
Okay, I'm vaguely familiar with NEOM, and hats off to the Saudis to advancing a sustainable city of the future. Given their history of providing significant shares of oil that have fueled our manufacturing and transport economies over decades and decades. The hydrogen technology, I think, is a sensible form of power generation and mobility, though there's a lot of uncertainties why that particular technology is being embraced versus electric solid state battery using alternative designs. But the principle of a mixed land use pattern, compact development, urban agriculture, all makes sense. There's so many I've looked at the plan, and they emphasize a lot of the co-benefits. When you start, instead of building streets, have space, you obviously cleanse the air through oxygen production of trees and sequester carbon. But even we've seen communities like this. I point out a place like Hammarby Sjöstedt, where when you start creating less paved over space and more open space in community gardens, people eat healthier, they're physically active, they get fresh fruits and vegetables every 2 days, and instead of huge refrigerators that they stock for 2 weeks of food and drive to Costco, they're not generating that electricity. So there's so many embedded co-benefits that come from that, and the plan, I think, embraces all that. So on balance, I think it's a huge 180 for Saudi Arabia and hopefully other parts of the Middle East. Dubai, I've been involved in the 2040 Dubai master plan, and it's a huge challenge to get them to sort of redirect themselves towards sustainability, but hopefully it will be a model for others to emulate.
Any other quick thoughts on NEOM?
I just point out that we will face, from an embodied emission standpoint, huge challenges of building in inhospitable climates, and I just want to point out that the Burj Khalifa required that they used ice jackets on the concrete pump lines to get the concrete up to the upper stories of that building before the concrete cured in the lines, and all this accrues to an enormous amount of emissions. So even though the city may be extremely efficient operationally, it will create an enormous carbon spike at the beginning of its life.
Thank you. And I can't figure out who's going to live there. I mean, they're designing this enormous system I'm not sure who the market is. I'm going to switch to an entirely different scale. There's a very interesting question. The small cities are not prepared to address climate change. They lack expertise, resources, in many cases, motivation on mitigation application. But there are many that are trying. And the question for all of you is, how might Yale or other groups help develop and offer a clear roadmap and shared platforms of policies and processes and best practices to help these smaller cities figure their pathway forward? Karen, you want to kick it off?
Yes, well, I think that's a great question, and I think that's not only about the adaptation of climate change, but also the range of climate actions to mitigate climate change. There's so many different experiments that are happening all around the world, and what is missing right now is not only a platform where there's shared knowledge, because there is actually a number of those. C40 is one of those, the Global Covenant of Mayors. But the challenge is about the implementation side. There's a lot of experiments and there's a lot of science on how to adapt, but the challenge is the implementation on the governance and the institution side. And I think that's where we might be able to offer something here at Yale, is bringing these different communities together to understand perhaps where we especially with regard to like co-benefits, where strategies to let's say mitigate climate change may also help us adapt. So anyway, I think the issue is really around developing scalable solutions and having a platform to learn about the synergies and also to bring in the governance aspects.
Albert, is there health guidance that, or public health guidance that can be formulated and given to cities in terms of best practices?
Yeah, so I think the question underlies two important issues. One that Karen and I share very much is that much of the growth that is going to be happening will happen in mid-sized and small cities rather than the megapolises. And so there are two initiatives. So one is through the World Bank. They've actually had specific health. I'm thinking globally rather than nationally, but there have been specific infrastructure capacity building, for whether it's medical services, access to public health. But surely that's enough. That's not enough, and that's almost like the Band-Aid. And as you had mentioned in your first, in your preface to this discussion, much of the issues are going to have to be dealt with more forward-thinking, multilateral or multidisciplinary approaches that really get at the social determinants rather than for example, a good example is psychiatric care or mental illness, health illness, which is it's an epidemic problem in much of the developing world. It's a problem here in the United States, exacerbated by urbanization. It's one thing to provide access to mental health institutes, and there's a large program due to the rising burden of disease from mental health. But really, what are the drivers? The drivers are the long transits, the stress, the violence in many of these cities. So that I don't see. I'm not sure if the other members really have any, have seen other large-scale multilateral initiatives, from the World Bank and so forth to address, or the regional developmental banks to address those issues.
One of the, not solutions, but mitigators of the mental health issues is bringing nature into cities, which we see, for example, in Singapore. But the more people are, there's studies that show the more people are next to parks and open space and trees, the better their mental health in urban locations.
Jonathan, maybe just a quick comment on that. The problem there is that those are very, difficult to quantify. The outcomes, the health outcomes are very difficult to quantify the cause and effect of those, which always then, when you make the investment case, goes to the bottom of the list. And that's kind of the key critical barrier to these type of broader green pathway initiatives for health.
So that's an area where Yale could do some meaningful research to make the case or prove that we think there's a strong case in there. But we'll. So another question that came in is about 15-minute neighborhoods, which I'd love for all of you to talk about. And the question really is it more attainable in the global north than in the south? And that the images we saw in the global south of enormous density and poverty, but even when there's not poverty, imply that the settlement patterns there are really different. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. Albert, you're the one that's to lead first, so why don't you give us your thoughts on are these 15-minute neighborhoods viable in the South, and let's go on to others.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, this is where I probably need primers from the rest of the group, but I'm thinking about as urban growth has happened, and as particularly urban slum communities happened in a very disorganized manner, the imprinting has already been set. And I'm thinking about countries, for example, in Latin America, that already went past that phase of urbanization. Obviously, we have to think of what's going to happen in South India, Southeast Asia, in Africa, and see the cautionary tales that happened in the Americas. But the question is and this has been this proverbial slum upgrading. How do you take communities that have been entrenched for decades with disorganized structures and impose lighting for playgrounds, where access to electricity is difficult, so kids can play safely. Where you can have latrines, where in the evenings women can go without the fear of being raped. Those are the thorny issues, and that's really, I would say, the bar that if we can't answer that question, it's going to also be very difficult to set a paradigm for those rapidly urbanizing places, and that's and I can just tell you how we have failed as a medical community or as a public health community. We're giving vaccines, we're giving putting pharmacies in those communities, we're putting health posts, but those aren't the drivers. We're not addressing the drivers, we're addressing the symptoms of
If I could just comment briefly in the 15-minute city, virtually every city in the world has embraced it, but in truth, it's not a new idea. The pre-automobile city was a 15-minute city. Even China, if you look in Shanghai in the 1960s, most people, 60%, 70% of activities they could get to by foot or bike in 5 minutes. The organically evolved city had shops and mom and pop stores and playgrounds all intermingled in the walkable city. It's only as cities have modernized and we've built global north infrastructure and massive superhighways that we've transformed a lot of the global south cities into more US, European-like car-dependent cities and sprawl and all the high social environmental costs that go with that. So in many ways, it's back to the future. If we could, that's kind of nothing's new here. The neo-traditional community is based on that very principle. I think we put a new spin on it, 15 minutes, and it's something I think people can relate to. The important thing to me is that it's really shifted the needle where we are reclaiming the city. We're seeing, particularly in the post-pandemic city, we're seeing a lot of real estate that was given over to cars, parking and roadways, spread over to cyclists and mini scooter users and so forth. So it's an important to me marketing concept, and it seems to resonate. And I think we should move, but in many ways it's sort of returning to the city, not dominated by cars.
So we're supposed to end now, but I'm going to ask one question. We're going to go over a little bit. I'm going to want to ask one final question to each one of you, which is, which really builds on what you just said, Robert, which is, what are the lessons that we've learned from COVID? And we don't know what the future is going to be, but what do you think the impact of COVID is going to be in the places where you're working? And Katie, let's start with you.
The impact of COVID, obviously nobody knows. Right now, it feels like we're really risking this decentralization that Robert was speaking about. But at the same time, I think what we've also learned is that people want to be with each other. People want people places, they miss it. And I can't but think that that is going to come back, where people are, again, attracted to places where they can find other people and socialize and live in buildings in tight-knit quarters. So, and at this point too, just on a basic real estate kind of market front, we don't see it slowing down. Like in Ottawa, Canada, there are new starts, there are high-rise construction, there are people interested in our land, and it is intensive urban development. So.
Thank you. Alan.
It'll have a profound effect on how we think about planning of buildings and sizing of rooms and spaces and how we program spaces. We're working on an affordable housing project in mass timber for the Dixwell community in New Haven. And we'd already designed the building when COVID hit, and we're getting our low income tax credit review right now. But all of us in the design team are sitting and thinking, the limits that CHFA, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, has placed on minimum sizes and the kinds of room requirements have to be completely rethought, because people need spaces to escape to, and they need balconies and terraces to use privately. These will have costs, and we're going to have to reshape the sort of value assessments that we put on these things. And I'll just say, this goes to the question, Jonathan, you raised at the beginning, which is, how do we create social equity if the very wealthy can just escape to places, rural hideaways? What does that leave the people who are really forced to inhabit the cities that are already built, because we don't want to tear them down and refashion them? So I think these are really, really important planning questions that will, I think, really catalyze a big change in the planning community and how we understand affordability and minimum in design.
Thank you. I hope so. And by the way, just to build on that, one of the things we've seen from COVID is so many families. My daughter moved in, her husband moved in with us in part so that we could help take care of the grandchild. And I hear that story over and over again. We don't have, most homes are not designed to be multi-generational. 100 years ago, they were only multi-generational, 120 years ago. And so that's just one of the design standards that maybe will come out of this.
Not to mention that you actually increase the bandwidth for usership and durability of the product that you're making from a purely commercial standpoint, when you can accommodate all kinds of different household structures within the life cycle of a family. And I think that's another thing that we don't think longitudinally enough about, how families change and how buildings might adapt to that and become actually the subsidies for revenue, as rentals, or room for a big family to grow and then contract. So I think that's a really important point.
Great. Karen, what are your thoughts about the post-COVID city?
Yeah, well, this came up in the Q&A, and my response to that was that, and I wrote this in the chat, is that if you look at the UN data estimates on urbanization includes cities and towns of all sizes, right? It's not mega cities, and in fact, most of the future growth is going to happen in smaller towns and cities, and so. I think what will happen is that this is going to elongate the trend, but people are still, like Katie said, this is highlighting that we have a pent-up demand for socializing. People are not going to move to rural places where health services, educational opportunities are lower, even if you can get your Amazon package way out there. And so I think it is going to very likely change how we think about cities, but urbanization is a trend that is here to stay in the 21st century.
Good, I like that. Albert, I'm going to ask you to also answer your thoughts about the post-COVID city, and just to note that in the chat there, in the questions, there's some questions specifically for you about how to measure nature and humans in city. But what are your thoughts about what we're seeing in your projections for the post-COVID city?
I'm sorry, I'm probably only going to be able to do the first question. I have to give a talk for the Children's Museum.
Yeah.
So I think, if we look back at history, pandemics, epidemics have shaped urban planning. If you go to Buenos Aires, you go to Havana, you go to Philadelphia, New York, they've been influenced by yellow fever, cholera, even the 1918 pandemic. So we are going to see changes in our urban planning. And many of you know those changes much better than I do. The question is that how that's going to be affected by certainly technology and globalization. I think there's certainly going to be an upfront effect, or short-term effect, based on economic drivers, in terms of growth in the economy, unemployment, and so forth. In the long term, I think if you look back in history, what cleaned up slums, what put in access to sanitation, clean water, even before we knew about the biology, was good governance. When we think about here in New Haven and Olmsted, in the concept of healthy cities, it was really good governance. So I think that, to me, is probably going to be the one driver that maybe it's hard to predict, but I think it's going to depend on people, urban planners providing good evidence, good policy.
And Robert, your thoughts? Oh, you're muted. Robert, you're muted. We can't hear a word.
My apologies. besides what I had said before, besides reclaiming the city away from cars, widening sidewalks, and al fresco outdoor dining on former parking spaces, and cycle tracks. I mean, that's critically important. Let me just say a few things about public transport. I think it's the one thing we're very concerned, despite our investments of public transit, even before COVID, ridership was declining. It's plummeted. A lot of people don't feel it's going to recover. I've been one of those guys trying to advance the model of transit-oriented development for another number of years. But I also wrote a book in 1997 called Transit Villages for Suburbia. It was about how to design a sustainable city, kind of a 15-minute concept in suburbia with good transit. And I'm reminded of a city like Barcelona that doesn't have tall buildings. It's got a lot of 4 to 5 story walk-up wood frame construction. You don't have to be in an escalator, but you can achieve enough compactness to make transit work. I think we have to be a lot more creative of how we create compactness without Le Corbusier Tower in the Park designs with long elevator rides and so forth. And even things like local retail, where the transit village idea was more community local retail, where you don't have many people descending on the community. It's much more of a typology of different types of development in suburban context. So I think, again, we have to be creative of how we design public spaces and compactness in ways that allow still people to travel sustainably and efficiently on some kind of shared form of mobility. If it really is the future of private mobility escalated by autonomous vehicles, and if we don't make the quick switch to electromobility, then the costs are going to be very high.
Thank you. You know, you've said private mobility several times, and I think the bottom line is that the healthy city is a city that thinks about the common good and not just the private good, that balances them. Maybe we need a greater balance towards the common good, and the common good is not only the common human social good, but it's the common environmental good. So with that, I'm going to leave you all to your own comments. Thank you so much for joining us, Robert, Karen, Alan, Katie, and Albert. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I know that Yale will have many more of these dialogues to come.
Thanks very much, Jonathan.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks all.